Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all. It's my pleasure being here today and talk about some of the data we collected examining scientists' perception of a wide range of issues related to public communication of science. I have to say that I come more from the audience perspective, and since empirical evidence does suggest that the public find out about science mainly through the media, I focus more particularly in scientists' perceptions of their intersection with media and how this may be changing nowadays with the evolution of new media environments. So what I would like to talk about today is basically give you, first of all, an overview of a study that we published in Science in 2008. That was the first study that tackled a cross-cultural comparison of scientists' perceptions of interaction with mass media with colleagues in 5 different countries. And then I move on and go more specifically into the analysis of the American data and try to see why American scientists tend or not to interact with mass media with which goal in mind. I will then cover a specific case study, going even more succinct here at a major research university, actually full disclosure, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and looking at the scientist process, particularly through social media at this specific institution. Sorry, I'm tired. I've been running around between cities this morning and avoiding snowstorms. And particularly looking at something that we thought was very interesting is the idea that how online buzz that's created through Twitter may actually help scientists increase their academic impact and what type of reward they can get through this. So the first study that I wanted to tackle here was basically looking at a survey of 1,200 biomedical scientists in 5 research and development countries: Germany, France, Japan, United States, and the UK. Well, at that time, it was the most appropriate sample. We may have to add China and India if we were to redo this right now. But really, they were interesting because we had a strong evidence suggesting that the attitude would be different among these countries. Why biomedical field? Because obviously, if we interact other fields, we will have also in the introduction of potential variables that would confound our research that really wanted to tackle what was about perception that was different. We did choose 2 fields of biomedical studies, stem cell research and epidemiology, because they really differ as far as their social context. Epidemiology much more like society-oriented as far as public health, and stem cell research really much more individual-oriented with gene therapy and so on. And so what we found actually, and I think Bruce in his opening remark did allude to that, is that those interactions between scientists and journalists were way more frequent than what previously thought. And that's across country, much more stable and than persistent anecdotal tales evidence would suggest. Our evidence does show that a lot of scientists, actually a lot, those scientists that had published, again, I didn't talk about the sampling, we can talk about it later on, but we're talking about biomedical scientists that have published extensively in epidemiology and stem cell. So 30% of those said they had engaged in more than 5 media contacts in the last 5 years. And people would say, but maybe it's because the others don't actually interact at all. No, actually, 39% on top of that reported 1 to 5 contacts, so at least some contact with the media, and only, therefore, a minority having never interacted with the media. And interestingly enough, we didn't find statistical significant differences between the countries we study. So also, something that was particularly interesting is that these interactions between scientists and journalists were perceived positively. Here, I have a number of questions we asked them. United States here is in green, asking them what type of rewards or what type of impact did those interactions have when they were completed in the last year or so. And something that's particularly interesting here and that really really counter anecdotal evidence is that most of our scientists, the majority of the scientists, concluded that they had received favorable publicity out of those interactions. So if you look at here this graph, you see that the way we have arranged it here is like the mean to the each questions from strongly disagree to agree, with basically all of them falling the positive side. We really didn't have any country for which, and sample indicate that it was actually not okay for them to interact with journalists. They all have positive things to say about it. Remember, we asked them to reflect on their own experience. And this is something that research consistently show. When you ask actually people to reflect on general assessment of how it works, they will tend to have much more negative assessment than when you tell them, wait a minute now, think about your interactions. How do you feel about it? And then it's something that, again, to keep in mind when we put empirical evidence in the face of anecdotal evidence, as far as thinking in terms of those public communication exercise. I think that's also very interesting, too, is asking them the perceived impact of those media contexts on their career. And again, here, we were interested in finding out that overall, most scientists thought that those impacts were either positive or at least neutral. If you look at USA here, the blue is positively impact on their career. The yellow is relatively balanced. So 80% of our American sample here and here that overall either good or no impact. Again, I think that also goes against the anecdotal evidence that seems to suggest that scientists think that this is not good for their career. So basically that was giving us a snapshot, good overall portrayal. We got a lot of press coverage at that time. That study was published in 2008 in Science, and actually a lot also of anecdotal evidence from scientists telling us that they were pleased to see that our study corroborate their own experience. So I think this is important to keep in mind when we think in terms of those studies. So we went more in detail into the American data and tried to tease out why would people actually engage with media. And we called those two specific dimensions we want to tackle, intrinsic rewards and extrinsic rewards. I was pleased to say that Rick actually had noticed that was the important aspects to consider. Do people engage with media because it gives them some personal satisfaction? Or do they engage with media because there are external factors that make them want to do so, such as tenure, such as gratification with other type funding agency and such? And so again, this was a part of that largest data set, and we focused on those American scientists that had responded. And we did a TDM, actually, it's a multiple wave mail survey, and actually we were really pleased to see that we didn't have difference between the late respondents and the earlier ones. We tend to suggest that our sample was really pretty well representing the population and the study. So what we found here is like obviously consistent with what I told you before. We have 36% of our scientists that had 1 to 5 contact with the media in the last 3 years, and 28% that are more than 5 contacts. So we focused on this specific variable and conducted logistic regression to try to explain why they would do so. And based on available literature and the studies I think Bruce mentioned earlier on, we more particularly focused on these variables. First of all, the status. Is it because you actually well established in your field that you would tend to interact with the media? Intrinsic reward, is it because you actually particularly enjoy interacting with media, because you like to explain your research, you like to contribute to public debate, and so on? We have five items here. Extrinsic negative rewards, because you are concerned that this will generate outside criticism. For example, critical reaction from peers, negative publicity, actually disapproval from the head of your department, and so on, and all those actually were, behaving well together as a scale. Extrinsic positive rewards, these outcomes that make scientists positive in media contact, more visibility for funders, I mentioned before, enhanced public reputation, and so on. Media familiarity, and that's something I'm going to talk about later on. Indeed, the more familiar you are with communication conduit, the more likely you are to actually engage with these media, so this is something we want to control for. Formal communication training, and this is something that we included for distinct audiences, training towards public speaking or training with, how to interact with media specialists and so on. And finally, communication self-efficacy, that idea that I can do it, I feel confident enough to conduct this type of exercise. So basically, logistic regression is, building a model based on data, accounting for the explanatory power of each of those variables, but taking account all of them. And so what did we find, actually? Very interesting result here. If I can move the slide. Here, I just put the independent variables that were significant in the model, okay? So what ended up explaining the likelihood of frequent interaction with mass media in this model, and I don't know why the legend doesn't show here, is basically number one, status, so we're not very surprised about that, right? I'm sure you talked about that. Second of all, personal training, and this is something that we can discuss later on. Feelings of self-efficacy, that self-confidence that you bring to the task, and intrinsic reward. Again, against anecdotal evidence to some extent, here we don't have enough evidence suggesting that those extrinsic rewards, which is getting more visibility from funders, which is approval from your peers, etc., could explain why you would interact with media. Basically, what we found particularly interesting is I do it because I feel good about it. So really in individual predisposition toward that, and I think to some extent it goes back to what Diane was mentioning about how personality and personal motivation will actually play the biggest role in this thing. So move on to a more case study type of approach, a study we just conducted at UW-Madison, because to some extent, and honestly, I think that data from a 2008 Science study is outdated. What happened since then? Well, we have Twitter that was created, Facebook that was launched, YouTube that came to be as an important social media platform, and basically a shuttering and transformation of science communication as we know. And so basically, like thinking in terms of media interactions with the journalist as to some extent, the person in between the scientists and the public, I think it's extremely outdated, and we can discuss that later on. But infrastructures have changed, channels have changed, so now basically scientists can go on their own and really communicate their research without anybody else having anything to say about it, unless public affairs and university go around it. I think you have talked about that. So the rise of science blogging and tweeting is extremely important to mention, because as a colleague of mine had mentioned recently in Nature Chemistry, it's not possible to talk about science blogging without talking about scientists blogging, or more broadly about scientists writing. And we're not talking about a few scientists as it used to be, let's say, 10 years ago. We're talking about crowd of scientists. I gave a keynote speak at the American Association for the Advancement of Science last February, and I was actually surprised. I was talking about science and social media. I have 800 scientists in the room trying to find out about how to get involved in social media and how to actually communicate with public in a broader way. Is it a rise of a new form of scientists? Those scientists that actually, are actually considering that those activities are part of their life. They, they tweet, they blog for various reasons, and that's what we want to try to find out. Multiple hats for the scientists of tomorrow, where they're not only researchers, also bloggers and journalists and editors. We cannot talk about gatekeeping anymore, where you have some step in the media organization that decide what will go out. What goes out is what audience want to have out, and what goes viral is what publics decide is interesting. To some extent, those dynamics are really in need of empirical data to explain how they work. But just focusing on Why would scientists engage through social media? This is a paper that actually is revised and resubmitted. It's not fully peer-reviewed, but I share with you. See, I'm open to the sharing here. And we will be presented at, in Salvador at the Public Communication Science and Technology Conference, where we will be attending with Bruce and hopefully others in the room. So what we did here is a survey of all the STEM tenure track scientists at UW-Madison. Again, why do I specify this? Because I think it's important to realize that we cannot generalize across universities. Each university has their own structure and their own infrastructure, actually, that may produce frictions and momentums related to public communication of science. We had actually a decent N of 254 that represented the gender distribution, the discipline distribution, the profile of the scientific community at the university. And we assessed there a lot of data, actually, but particularly the use of social media. First, what we can see here is that across age group and across discipline, and we don't have a difference, and I hope you can see, here that although you have 50%, 58% of our respondents that never blog about their research, I think the interesting thing is to show that actually the rest do. So this is a lot. Okay, so like when you think particularly here, if you look at those that do once a month or more, we have 18% of all disciplines and age and gender confounded that do blog about research at least once a month. Obviously, this is something was not, you know, even conceivable 5 years ago. And what's more interesting is that if you look at tweets, you see those numbers go up a lot. Although you have more that never do it, more do it very often. Almost 20% do it at least once a month, which means 1 out of 5 scientists at UW-Madison do a tweet about their research. It's like an activity that's actually part of their element. So what we did is like we did another regression here, our favorite method of analysis here, to predict why they would use these for science-related purposes. And what's interesting here is as far as Facebook is concerned, political ideology was the main predictor of the likelihood of posting their research on Facebook. We can discuss. It goes, that's a different element here, with liberals tending to be more open about posting than conservative. More interesting, though, is Twitter, because I think Twitter is much more an academic, a research-oriented type of platform for scientists such as myself, for example. And you can see here that people that are used to social media in general, that's not just for science purpose, tend to actually post about their research too, and those that do it more in a passive way won't do it for their own research. However, the finding I want to keep with you and for food for thought as far as momentum is this one, where you see that actually one of the main predictors of people using Facebook and Twitter, actually Twitter here, to talk about research is their self-thinking they should actively seek new ways to share their research. So it's really about, you know, like I would say, a change in the cultural outlook of what it means to communicate about science. How am I doing about that? Okay. Oh, yeah, right. So what I want to say, though, is difficult to generate these results. UW-Madison does actually reward being in the news. You get like a big, like, yeah, I'm on the front page of Wisconsin, you know, UW page. We do have a big expert guide database where everybody's, you know, pushed to actually be part of this. And we have a very active social media platform where, again, you get rewarded if somebody tweet about you. Each institutional organization within university tweets about the research and really try to push researchers to show them. So very quickly here in 1 minute, last study. Okay, so they tweet. Is it good for them? Does it actually help their career? what's that online buzz and how can it impact academic, visibility? Another regression here, I'm not going to show it in detail. The only thing I wanted to show you here is how we predicted H index, which is basically the likelihood of having your publication not only being cited a lot, but also each of them is cited a lot. Basically, you account for the fact that one publication may be cited a lot, which we don't want. You want a lot of publications cited a lot. So predicting the H index here, what was particularly interesting for us is say, what good does it do to tweet? Does it help? Is it something that will enhance and amplify research that we have seen in regular traditional media platforms where interacting with reporters indeed help your paper being cited? And so what we found here, though, is interacting with reporters and being mentioned on Twitter does impact and amplify your academic impact by increasing your H index. So basically here, interacting with reporters, either less or more, compared to actually, the down is blue here. If you're not mentioned on Twitter, really doesn't change much. But if you are mentioned on Twitter here, and that's the second graph thing, you can see that you have a strong interaction effect between these two public communication activities, very different. One traditional one and one that's actually really clearly related to a use of social media. So basically, Twitter can amplify the effect of other type of communications on academic impact. And from an academic visibility standpoint, really right now, the essential question, at least in institutions such as UW-Madison, heavily research, visible type of institution, the essential question is not whether they should engage with social media to communicate, but how to do so. And the question I put on the table, I think this is clearly a momentum that we should size, is the friction that it generates. Do they know how to do it? I mean, not as far as technique is concerned. I mean, Twitter is really simple. But do they understand actually the social science behind it? Do they understand the dangers? Do they understand priming, framing, and other communication theories that do show that indeed this kind of wide communication exercise can really backfire, as some of our research on blog comments has shown. And basically, I will leave it here. Institution barriers are not apparent. Training and self-efficacy were the main predictors of interaction with media. And I do think that we have seen a change in the way scientists perceive communication in social settings. By the way, I should have pointed out in that slide before that age didn't have a significant effect on being present on social media for science. So we need to stop to some extent saying it's just the young scientist. It's really a change, I would say, in the dynamic of science communication. We need more data. I've got the stern look, but basically we can talk more about the type of research that needed. I have a lot of data on the use of ResearchGate and other online research community that could complement Diana, so we can talk about that. Thank you.